welcome to this most important session on something that is very dear to all of us. Can India become a wealthy nation by 2047, the anniversary of our independence? How do we define a wealthy nation? What are the metrics that we need to use? Do we go by GDP? Do we go by per capita income? Do we go by human indicators, development indicators? What are the metrics? And how realistic is this objective to become a wealthy nation by 2047? What are the pitfalls? What do we need to do from here onwards? Let's not dwell too much on the past. What do we need to do from here onwards to achieve this objective? These are some of the important questions that come to my mind when I thought of this subject. And these are some of the questions that I would like to pose to our distinguished set of panelists here. I don't have to introduce any of them. The collective experience of the gentleman and the lady on the stage is more than 200 years in policy making, economics, journalism, and government. And I see some very well-known faces in the audience here. So if I take all that into account, the total experience that can weigh in on this subject is several multiples of the 200 years that's on stage. So I don't want to weigh in with my own comments or lectures here. I'll go straight into the subject because we have just about an hour and I can see the clock ticking away in front of me. So the way we plan to do this is I will invite each of the panelists to have an opening statement for about 5 minutes, and then we'll proceed with questions from me and questions between the panelists as well. And at the end of 1 hour, we'll throw the floor open to the audience for your questions. I'll start with home. Mr. Ravi, can you tell us how realistic is this objective of India becoming a developed nation by 2047?
To be in the midst of the experts here and with a provocative title could be overwhelming, but it could also be a useful learning experience for me. How far down the horizon can one see? Let me start with the oft-repeated quote from John Maynard Keynes: "The long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead." However, the long run allows us to dream and to dream big, to set the sight high, to set a specific target is no doubt good, but the political subtext in speaking about 2047 is not to be missed. At one level, it marks a centenary of independence and offers a plausible target date. At another, it heightens the aspirations of the youth, selling them a dream. In fact, only yesterday, the President's speech on the eve of Republic Day spoke of, and I quote, making Bharat a developed nation when it completes 100 years of independence. What exactly is a rich nation or a developed nation? Not surprisingly, economists seem as divided as politicians on how the government has managed the economy. The subtext to the debate is the competence of the government to manage the economy, with there being hardly any economist of international standing within the government in contrast to the previous governments. The competence charge is, of course, turned upside down with the criticism that 4 decades and more of Nehruvian socialism had left the country with the so-called Hindu rate of growth of 3%. The division becomes stark from the issues and phrases they pick up for discussion. The favorite talking point of one school is the gross domestic product that places India among the top 5 economies, and the country is soon set to overtake Japan and Germany to become the 3rd largest. But then, is not per capita income the real measure of development and well-being? According to the IMF World Economic Outlook 2023, the GDP per capita of India is projected at $2,612 at current prices, which places it at the 143rd position out of 195 economies. The government's own narrative picks up such themes as the big push on infrastructure, massive welfare programs, including the free distribution of food grains for 5 years, which is described as the largest welfare program in the world, housing and sanitation projects, universal COVID vaccination in record time, opening of bank accounts, the surge in digital payments, and reforms such as the GST, the bankruptcy code, and privatization of Air India, and the cleaning up of bank balance sheets. Critics, however, point to the high level of youth unemployment at 40%, millions of malnourished children, deep structural problems such as the growing fiscal deficit that currently stands at 5.9% of the GDP for the center alone, the decline in the investment rate, the world trade environment turning hostile, geopolitical disturbances, the growing social harmony within the country, environmental degradation, and the lack of credible statistics, with the data being revised frequently. In that context, coming to the question itself posed by the title of this session, can India become a wealthy nation by 2047? According to the World Bank classification, high-income countries are those with a per capita income of over $13,200, and upper middle income between $4,250 and $13,200. One estimate given out by the chairman of the Prime Minister's Council of Economic Advisors, Vivek Debroy, estimates that by 2047, India's GDP would be $20 trillion and per capita income $10,000. This could be achieved even with a relatively modest per capita income growth of just over 6%, or a GDP growth rate of between 6.5% to 7%. This would only place India among the upper middle income countries. While this in itself is quite laudable, will it change the quality of life to the extent promised? Looking at what is to be done to push the growth to beyond 7 or 8%, I will take up one critical issue, education, in the next round.
Thank you, Mr. Ravi. That sets the tone. May I now request Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia to give us opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be invited to the Hindu Litfest. So let me thank the organizers for inviting me. You know, you asked us to look forward. And I mean, Ravi has given a pretty comprehensive account of the past, so I won't go over that. The question you asked was, can we, at various stages, you say a rich economy, sometimes it's said to be a developed economy, sometimes it's said to be a high-income economy. Now, let's be clear. The criterion is always per capita income. So all this talk about so many $1 trillion, that's neither here nor there. I mean, we certainly need to become many more $1 trillion in order to become a high-income economy, but we could reach those $1 trillion still being a low-income economy. So the issue is per capita income. There, I think your question translates, in my view, into the following. Number one, whatever target you like, 13,000, 14,000 per capita, what does it mean for GDP? Okay? And I think people vary in their assessments, but it means 8.5% growth over the next 23 years, all right? Now, this is relevant because, you know, if you're already growing at 8.5%, we can say, well, you know, we'll probably get there. Though, mind you, to be developed is not just enough to have high per capita income. It has to be better distributed. So, I mean, well distributed. So you could end up with a high-income economy in which the distribution deteriorates so much that large numbers of people are kind of left out. I mean, I'm not saying it'll happen, but that's an issue. So you need that 8.5% growth. You need that growth to be inclusive. And I think along with inclusive growth, which is just the benefits of income, you also need the development of public goods, which cannot be provided by the market, have to be provided by a caring government. And by the way, that government is not the central government. Almost all the public goods that you really care about, health, education, law and order, clean drinking water, livable cities, all of these things are in the hands of state governments and municipalities. So looking 22 years ahead, the question you really ask is, can we grow at 8.5%? Will it be inclusive? Will the governments, not just the central government, state governments, be responsive to the need to provide the kind of public services that a developed country needs? Now, I mean, it's too difficult to answer those questions, but some contextual points we should keep in mind. First, are we growing at 8.5%? No. Nobody says we are. There's a lot of debate on what is the growth. Is NDA growth better than UPA growth? Actually, if you look at a straight comparison, it's not. The UPA growth was actually about 1.5% per year higher than NDA growth. But against that, many people will point out, quite rightly, that you have to look at the global situation. And the UPA had a better global environment. I'm even willing to settle for the proposition that, you know, the growth may not be that much different if you allow for the global situation. But what that means is the global situation is what it is. Unless you believe it's going to improve phenomenally, the real challenge is we are kind of growing around 6.5%. Can we grow at 8.5%? Now, looking forward, three things are actually very important. Number one, the world is not going to be as benign as it used to be. I mean, in the past 20 years was a period when everybody believed that the world was becoming peacefully multipolar, trade was happily taking place, everybody was quite happy to see globalizations. That has clearly changed. Now, I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about the last couple of years, and maybe we'll get back to something more sensible. But you have to keep in mind that if it's a more troubled world, then getting this 8.5% is not going to be based on the same kind of principles that we were applying earlier. Okay, that's one issue. Second, technology is changing phenomenally, and is changing at a much more rapid pace than it did before. This is causing tension and presenting challenges, not just to us, but even the developed countries. And one of the critical things is that the technology change is likely, for the first time, to lead to a net reduction in the demand for labor. I mean, historically, we have always argued, with a lot of justice, that, look, technology diminishes some jobs, but it creates other jobs which are usually better. That has historically been true. Will it be true? The short answer is, I don't know. I mean, we need to do much more work on understanding how the new technologies will actually infiltrate into the production space. Now, some aspects of the new technology are definitely advantageous. The digitalization, the payment system, all that's happening on fintechs, these are good things. They're creating new jobs. They're in some ways supplementing what banks do, but they're increasing the efficiency with which credit can be extended. That's good. But you know, when you get to automation, AI, and so on, I mean, most of the research that I've seen says that something like 40 to 50% of the jobs that we know of now are going to disappear. Now, if you agree that actually new jobs will be created, the challenge it poses is your educational system going to be capable not just of getting the labor force ready for the needs of today, but being able to recycle that same labor force for future needs. It won't be a world in which you will have what my generation had, which is work hard, get a good degree, then get a job and forget about education because you've done all the education you need. It's going to be quite different. people will sort of have to retool themselves. Now, I don't think we should get frightened of this because all countries are facing this challenge. But honestly, what we need is to recognize that there is need for much, much greater flexibility in our systems. So rigid, top-down, prescribed systems are not good. And this brings me to my last point. And that is, I mentioned the quality of government and ability to deliver services, okay? It seems to me that it's going to be very crucial that probably 70% of what we call the quality of government is going to be determined at the state level. And then you come to the political question, to what extent does that depend on a lot of flexibility with the states, and how does that alter the center-state relationship? Now, you know, I live in Delhi and we like to believe that all decisions, and when I was in government, by the way, this was with the sole exception of Manishankar Ayya. I think I saw him leave, perhaps in disgust. But apart from Manishankar Ayya, virtually everybody would say that, you know, the central government is better equipped, et cetera, But frankly, while I was in the Planning Commission, I clearly changed my mind on that. I think if we don't allow the states more flexibility in virtually everything, including education, including, health services, and most of all, this new dimension, handling climate change. I mean, the challenges of climate change in Chennai are very different from what they are in Uttaranchal. So we will need to evolve a system of government in which the public recognizes that it's the states that must be held responsible for delivery. The center will be responsible for macroeconomic stability, some of the basic national infrastructure, which a lot is being done on that, let's face it. But I think the other side is what now needs to come into play much more strongly. So really, it's a tough job. Now, having said that, let me say, if we miss the high income level, but get close to it, that's not bad either. I mean, we're sort of somewhere below $3,000 per capita. Will we reach 13,200 in today's prices by 1947? Pretty tough, from what I'm saying. Depends on whether we're willing to adjust to the changes that we are seeing. But let's face it, even if we get to 12,000, that's not bad. So I think the real question is, what's the rate of growth that we can achieve? My feeling is that, look, if we target 8.5 and get 8, that's pretty good. Or even to get a little below 8. My last point, and this is very relevant for judging how we are doing. You know, as an economy grows, it's well established that its rate of growth slows down. I mean, if India is going to grow rapidly to become sort of close to high income level by 2047, and the average growth rate you need for that is 8.5%, then quite frankly, if you're tracking whether you are on track, you should be allowing to grow 9.5 now and slow down to 7 by the end. We cannot be expecting to grow that rapidly if we become a high-income country. So when you track what's happening, I don't think the relevant metric is 8.5. The relevant metric is that short-term growth rate, which is consistent with an average of 8.5, allowing for the fact that a slowdown is essential. Now, you know, these numbers might change, 8.5, 8.2, that's not very important. But I think by any standard, we must accept that right now, the growth is not what it needs to be. And that's partly why we're not seeing the employment results that we want. I mean, the fact is, if we got anywhere near the growth we want to track, you would see that result. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. Very important observations, especially on growth and inclusive growth, and whether we can achieve 8, 8.5. Mr. Ninan, China has consistently done that rate of growth over 2 decades, over 8%, which has lifted its economy to a higher level than what it was when it started its reforms. Now, when we talk of growth of 8, 8.5%, and inclusive growth at that. What does it take for governments from now onwards for the next 24 years to achieve that? And as Mr. Ahluwalia said, average of 8 to 8.5. So that means initially you're going to be looking at 10, 11, 12%, and then maybe as you grow further, it'll be 5, 6%. So what does it take?
Hello, am I audible? Oh, okay. Thanks, Mr. Srinivasan, and morning, everybody. To answer that question, there are two ways of doing it. One is to look at your own history and see how it could have been improved. The second is to look at the history of other countries and see how they did it. So let's put this into context. We are looking ahead at 24 years. So let's look back at the last 24 years and start from 2000 AD and look at today. In this period, India's per capita income, and I agree with Montek, when you're looking at being rich, you're talking about individual incomes. The per capita income for India in this close to quarter century went up less than threefold, less than 3 times. In the same period, China went up more than 5 times, 5.3 times actually. If you had to look at Ravi's numbers from the World Bank of reaching the threshold of being high income, which is actually for the latest year, it's $13,800 US, and we are at about 2,600. You would have to multiply about 5.3 times, which is exactly what China did. Now, the question therefore is, if this is a reasonable proposition, can you do what China has done in the last quarter century, which is, long periods of double-digit growth, extraordinary technological progress, virtually full employment, and a great deal else. And you have to ask yourself, are we really capable of doing that? Then let's leave in China aside and look at the rest of the world. And I want to suggest that we've become somewhat unrealistic in our growth expectations because of what some East Asian countries have done in post-1950. The examples being South Korea and Taiwan principally, Japan before that, and of course China. Now, historically, the kind of growth rates that these countries achieved, which is Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and mainland China, all of them achieved 9 to 10% growth annually for about 3 decades, and that's how they launched themselves. But that's not the rate at which either Europe or the United States grew to great affluence. They grew over much longer periods at much slower rates. For instance, the United States in 1870, after the Civil War, it was still largely a rural economy, had a total GDP of $98 billion. By 2013, just before World War I, so it's a span of 43 years, 98 had become 517, which is again, this is a magic number of 5.3 times, but in 43 years. And in those 43 years, you had electricity coming in a major way, you had railroad transport, you had the energy, sources of energy changing dramatically, you had phenomenal productivity growth. And yet, over 43 years, the US grew only 5.3 times, which is a per cap annual average of less than 4.5%. And in its fastest period, in this 43 years, during the fastest phase, they were growing only at 6%. Europe grew on the back of the slave trade in the 18th century, on the back of colonialism in the 19th and 20th century. We don't have those. So I think historically, this is an extraordinary period of unusually rapid growth. So if you're doing 6.5, I think we're doing bloody well. Now, can you do 8 Only a few handful of countries have done it. Do you have the conditions, and not just capital, financial capital, human capital given your education system, the health indicators, the soft factors, all your institutional strengths, which if anything are decaying, and the nature capital. Can your environment and your ecology cope with 1.6 billion people with this expenditure of $15,000 per head? The world hasn't seen this. And your water resources are already scarce. Your cities are polluted. So I think we have to have a certain measure of realism about this. The second is, what is rich? Saudi Arabia is rich, but is it developed? China is not rich. China is actually still less than the World Bank high income threshold. But Maldives is rich. Maldives per capita income is 25% bigger than China. Do we want to be like that? So let's look at the real issues, which I think some speakers referred to, which is the quality of life. Do people have jobs? Do you have clean air? Have you got education? Do you have health care? These are the issues. What do people care about? That's what they care about. Do you have personal safety? What is the commuting time? How many years' income does it take to buy a house? So if you break those down, and there are indicators which people do for what is called physical quality of life. When you look at quality of life, on these indicators, you will be very surprised. India is fractionally higher than China. Why? Because property prices in China are so high, nobody can afford a house. Why? Because the cost of living is enormous. People can't get married because they can't afford to get a place. So, if you look at all these factors, Bombay is the least quality of life in India. It's the richest city. What is the highest quality of life? Pune, followed by the southern cities, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai. So, I think we have to look at, then you have the human development indicator the UNDP puts together. None of these indicators factors in jobs and employment. Only 10% of our workforce is in the organized sector. I mean, how are you going to get from 10 to something more reasonable? And what does it take? Can you do it in 25 years? To me, it doesn't matter whether we become rich in 2047 or 2057. What matters is, can you give quality of life? Thank you.
That's a very important point that you have made. Quality of life is of greater importance than economic indicators of 8% or 8.5%. Mr. Kaul, I would now come to you. Where do you think India stands? Mr. Ninan said India stands better than China in some quality of life indicators, especially property prices, the affordability of a house. What do you think that India needs to do to improve the quality of life of its citizens going forward, especially when about 1 million people and more are getting into the workforce every year? How to create jobs? How to ensure that their quality of life improves?
Thank you. I'll take off from what Ms. Ninan took off, the two types of capital that you referred to, financial capital and human capital. And financial capital, I don't think we can do very much better than what we've been doing. But I certainly am very optimistic that if you change your policy trajectory, you can do wonders to your human capital. And the demographic dividend that we have for the next 2 decades is what we can exploit. And I am willing to wager a bet that within the next 10 years, you can sharply improve quality of life indicators without the kind of GDP investments in health and education that health activists in education talk about, which is 6% for health, because that is not going to happen. Neither will 2.5% of GDP in health. And I'll give you some illustrations as a Sarkari Babu, civil servant, plus wearing a corporate hat, of what governments can do if they are willing to keep open minds. You look at health. We spent about 30,000 crores on building 15 AIIMS. The same amount of money could have been used to strengthen 600 district hospitals. You spent 1,500 to 2,000 crores on each AIIMS. Now, why do I say that? Most people should not be going to AIIMS. They should be getting treated at the primary health center or at the referral health hospital. So it's a question of reordering priorities. Why should we be spending less than 10% on preventive and promotive health? Lifestyle issues and non-communicable diseases can be tackled with much better health education. That doesn't cost so much money. We have 30,000 primary health centers. You don't need more hospitals. But not less than 10% of them offer a safe delivery because they work 10 to 6. So they can't even offer a delivery at night. Why can't you make them run 24/7? You don't require a doctor, you require a staff nurse, 3 shifts. I visited hospitals in my period as a health commissioner, and I found that most hospitals don't even have something called a standard operating protocol which private hospitals have. So obviously service quality is poor. If you don't strengthen about 5,000 of the community hospitals, you will see a rush to district hospitals and overcrowding. So plenty can be done just in reprioritizing health, and same that goes with, can you get more women into the workplace? With 23% women, you cannot have a demographic dividend with women not being accepted. And the government strategy of educating women has not helped. Data shows that women with secondary education, the participation of women actually drops. It picks up with graduation. It picks up if you change patriarchal gender attitudes. What have we done? Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao is getting the girls to schools. That has not helped them access the marketplace. Changes in the way companies look at gender diversity, changes the way government looks at it. I'll give you an example. My son and daughter-in-law, both lawyers. They introduced 30% reservation in law schools for women. Today, 55% of students entering law schools are women. 40% of corporate lawyers are women. Those simple things which don't have huge budgetary impact can make a difference to improving access of women in the workplace. Look at nutrition and food security. We spend perhaps the largest, even in per capita terms, on food security. But there has to be a policy rethink. Why is it that despite this, there are high levels of malnutrition? Obviously, supply of cereals alone is not tackling your malnutrition and hunger. Child malnutrition can be tackled. It doesn't require, a 6-month-old child doesn't require much, even, it's not even without reach of poor households. We have to understand nutritional behavior of poor households. We have to address them. We have to reach out to households. Are there issues why processed foods are occupying their diets? Is it that there are nutritional imbalances because of lack of awareness? There are a lot of things which can be done through health education, through nutrition education, which can change why should 35% of children be stunted? And stunting means brain development, 80% takes place before the child is 2. And this stunting, has a long-term impact on the productivity of a human being as an adult. Why is it that 25% of adults remain underweight on one end, and the other end of the spectrum in India, you have 20% obesity? So the quality of our productive force can be improved with very little budgetary impact if policymakers are willing to look at the underlying causes rather than doing the same thing and more of the same thing. I'll just give you one small, another example of livelihoods. Now, the government has 2 major schemes. One is the PLI, the productivity linked investment, the incentives. Why cannot we link to employment as an indicator? China, I'm told, puts targets to companies for how much, not how much is the turnover, but how many they can employ. Why cannot that PLI have an indicator of employment? How many more people have you employed? Why cannot we not relook at a scheme like NREGA? NREGA is only for unskilled wage labor. Why cannot it employ health workers, education workers, remedial teachers, village assistants, pay them because they are more productive than just doing hard labor. Why cannot Narega look at urban settlements? Because if GDP growth, 70% will take place in urban settlements, the quality of our urban infrastructure is going to be a challenge. Will you have low-income housing? And in my book, I talk about a very radical, not government building houses. It's not going to happen. In the last 10 years, for example, Delhi built, the central government built 20,000 houses for the poor. The challenge was about 1 or 2 million a year, with 25% of the population living in slum settlements. So you need a rental housing market because all estimates indicate that 50 million households are going to come to towns and cities for looking for jobs. Where do they live? So these are the challenges which, with little changes in the policy trajectory, could make wonders. And I think in the next 10 years, if we can achieve, say, quality of life indicators equal to Kerala, we would have created a platform for the 8% growth that you spoke about.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Those are interesting suggestions, extending Narega to health and education, and rather than just in the urban areas, especially, rather than just digging ponds and wells somewhere in some rural area. But I would like to move to Ms. Jayati Ghosh now. My question to you is, the wish list is long. We all know what needs to be done in health, in education, in skilling, in human development indicators, in social capital, everything. The challenge is, if you're going to grow at less than 8%, how are you going to find the money for investing in all these? And are we investing enough even now at 6.5%, a 2% budget for health and 2.5% for education, state and centers put together? Isn't that very meager?
Yes, thank you. You know, lots of very interesting things have been said, and I'm going to pick up on some of them, but I want to go back before I answer your question to this question about being wealthy and what a wealthy nation is. Or stepping back a bit, why do we even want to be a wealthy nation? What's the point of being a wealthy nation? And I would argue that the point is for you to be able to provide every person in the country with basic needs and the possibility of a decent and dignified life. In a sense, what you were describing as the standards of living and so on. That can happen at very different levels of per capita income. So I'm not even sure that per capita income is necessarily the best indicator. It has happened in some countries at definitely middle income country kinds of status. I'm thinking, for example, of Malaysia. So, you know, wealth, it depends on how you define it. If you look at wealth really as the means to provide people in your country with what should be a decent and dignified life, then it requires a different pattern of growth rather than just the aggregate growth. So I would actually contest the idea that we need 8% or we need 10%, whatever number we need in terms of aggregate growth. It doesn't tell us about the pattern. It doesn't tell us about the distribution. It doesn't tell us who's benefiting. And therefore, it doesn't tell us who's actually getting that decent and dignified life. If you look at India over the last 10 years, for example, we've had a reasonably high rate of growth, especially given global conditions and so on. But we also know that real wages have not increased. That's stunning to me. In a country like India, you're growing at this rate for a decade, real wages are not increasing, to me is absolutely stunning. Median wages are falling for construction workers, for a number of others. I mean, it's absolutely crazy that this can happen. What does that tell us? It means that the conditions of the vast majority of the country are not improving. And to me, that's the sign of not being wealthy. To me, that's the real failure of that growth. So if you say, okay, we will continue to grow at this, not only do we get low employment generation, but we also get continuing poor quality of life for a large part of our population, certainly for the bottom 50%. And because of that, you get a low mass consumption market, which in turn reduces the incentive to invest, which is why you don't find private investment responding to this supposed fantastic growth rate. Our investment is now increasingly led by public investment in infrastructure. And it's because the private don't see a market, especially for all the, what do they call, fast-moving consumer goods that ordinary people consume or that the poor consume. So we really have to think about the pattern of growth. And I think if we want to achieve anything in terms of progress, material progress that matters for India, we have to be thinking about a different pattern of growth, not looking at that absolute number. Absolute, not just in aggregate, but even in per capita, but looking at, for example, the median wage. Let's suppose we make the median wage our indicator of progress, because that is a kind of proxy for what people can afford and so on. And we say zero growth in median wage is a disaster. How do we improve that? Then you start thinking about, okay, what can we do to improve employment? What can we do to improve access to basic needs? What can we do to improve access to health? Sanjay, I recognize your point that, quality of spending matters a lot, but hey, you can't get away from quantity either. It's 1%, by the way. Indian spending on health, public spending on health, center and state together, is less than 1% of GDP, 0.9 the last time I looked. We are down there in the bottom of all the countries in the world in terms of health spending. And you can't, therefore, get better quality without more increase. You need more doctors, nurses, caretakers, people to do all the ancillary jobs and so on and so forth. These are also hugely employment-generating activities. So if we recognize employment as a major goal, one critical thing, of course, is to transition out of low productivity activities. In agriculture, in primary activities, low-grade services, and so on. But that transition, therefore, requires specific proactive policies to generate the conditions that will enable both public and private employment. We definitely need much more public employment. We are underemploying. We are under-providing basic services. Okay? Our ratio of basic services, public employees to population, it's less than 2 per 100. Global average is 3.5 per 100. Scandinavian countries, 12 per 100. Why? Because they're providing better public services. We need more public employees to provide decent public services. And I completely agree with Montek, it has to be done in a much more federal way, in a way that allows states much more flexibility. But in addition to that, you have to create the conditions for private employment. So we have to think who's employing most of the people in the country. They are micro, small, and medium enterprises, which have been left by the wayside in this celebration of large capital which is supposed to trickle down in terms of its benefits. We definitely need much more systematic sector-wise packages for the MSMEs to enable them to survive. It's a miracle that many of them exist when you think about what they've been through, right? Demonetization, GST, COVID, and an incredibly brutal lockdown with very little in terms of any compensatory policies. So you have to think of the things that will generate more employment. You have to think of the things that would generate more basic needs. And delivering those is possible, but it definitely needs more investment. It can't happen without. And it needs more investment of a different kind, not just high-speed trains or major highways and so on. Not saying there's anything wrong, but you definitely need to spend much more on, if you like, the human investments that you have to make in terms of ensuring these. In terms of also the impact of technology, this is important. I think Montek mentioned this, the fact that, robotization, AI, et cetera, these are all job-destroying kinds of activities. We know, everywhere in the world we know, that the activities of the future that will be employment-generating are the care work and creative industries. So let's invest in those, and there's huge potential to actually invest in care. Just final point I want to make that, we are so, yes, youth unemployment is a big thing, but the way we are exploiting women's work in unpaid fashion in this country is actually extraordinary and I think unmatched anywhere in the world, okay? If you look at only paid employment, that is not unpaid work in family enterprises, 18% of women in this country have paid employment. 18%. We're worse than Saudi Arabia, okay? And this really means that there is this huge waste of enormous economic potential, but there is also a massive burden of unpaid work. 88% of the country, according to the official labor force, 88% of women in this country are working in unpaid altogether, including unpaid fashion. Only 18% get paid for their work. So if you're looking at aggregate labor productivity, it is subsuming all the unpaid work done by women. It's a pattern of growth which is not just deeply unequal, but deeply exploitative along gender lines. Also, I would add, along caste lines and other ethnic kinds of labor market segmentation. Those are the kinds of things we have to get away from if we really want a wealthy nation in the way that it matters.
Thank you, Ms. Jayati Ghosh. That's a very interesting perspective that you brought about on female labor participation and the free work that they do. Mr. Ahluwalia, I would like to ask you, Ms. Ghosh says, we need to raise the median income levels in this country, labor wages, median wages in the country. So how can we do that if you're going to grow only at 5%, 6%? Don't you need the economy to grow at a much faster rate, create more jobs, create more wealth, which can in turn be passed down the line as wages, as more jobs are created? How is that going to work?
Well, let me lay down my position. One, I agree with Jayati that the provision of these basic services should not be seen as something that's going to be consequential on getting high income. They should just be provided as basic public goods. And I think we can provide them even at our existing 6% rate of growth. It's a separate question why we're not doing so. And clearly, I mean, the numbers she gave are correct. If we ought to be spending, instead of 1% of GDP, she says actually a little lower, on health from the government, center and state together, we ought to be spending 2%. Certainly true also on education, that we ought to be spending more. So, I mean, actually what it boils down to is that independent of what you need for accelerating GDP growth, there I don't entirely agree with the view that our only problem is human capital. Financial capital is there. The fact of the matter is that our investment rates have been going down. So it's not as if we are investing as much as we used to, and so we need to be able to find resources for that. Now, obviously, one factor is that government is spending its money. Either is not collecting enough taxes. There's some truth in that because the tax ratio has been rather sort of stagnant, a little bit edging up in the last couple of years. And the promise of GST, that it would lead to a huge rise in tax ratio, has not materialized. We know why it has not materialized, because the GST was not structured the way it should be. And I think even the government recognizes that. I think the finance minister various times has said, yes, we must do some restructuring. It hasn't been done so far. But it does mean that government is spending money on things that are not either providing the basic services or generating the growth we need. I don't entirely agree with Ninan when he said it doesn't matter if we become a rich country by 1987, thus postponing, 57, yeah, okay, fair enough. All right, I misheard you, I apologize. But yes, that clearly, I mean, I think we need to have the provision of these basic services as a first call on government. And the second thing is we need to do better on growth. And my feeling is that doing better on growth, other things being the same, will generate a lot of the employment we need, subject to what happens on technology. So that's a challenge line going ahead. There's one other point we should mention, and that is the climate change factor. It's very clear no country, including us, is doing what is necessary to meet our own climate targets. And what they estimate is that for India, by 2100 or so, if the changing weather and rising temperature isn't altered, we will lose 15% of agricultural production. Now that's a huge decline, and we must counter that. And that requires more work on mitigation, more work on adaptation, making sure that we use water better and not use it inefficiently. But everyone can agree on these broad things. It's when you get to the policies that nobody is willing to agree. I mean, for example, is there anyone willing to say that electricity should not be given free to farmers? I mean, if you put it if you're ever standing for election and ask that question of your audience, you will not find a single person supporting that view. But you have to ask yourself the question that if you're not willing to use the price mechanism and you're not able to use rationing, I mean, it would be okay if you were able to use rationing, since that you only get this much water, so you don't have to have a price. I think if you go through each of these things, there are huge, we ought to move away from slogans, and I think we have moved from slogans to targets, which is a good thing, but we need to focus on programs and policies. What are the policies and what are the programs that will achieve the result, and what is the design of the programs that will achieve the result? There's virtually no discussion on that. We kind of stick at outcomes. We want to be rich, we want to have basic services, we want everyone to have essential needs, but exactly what government has to do different, that's really what we need to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. The sense that I get from this first round of discussion with, yeah.
Sorry to intervene, just one sentence. You know, growth necessary for employment. We have had a decade of relatively high growth, no increase in employment, no increase in median wages. So, okay, like 1%. I mean, come on. So that doesn't deliver. You have to think of a different pattern of growth.
If you take the 2 decades, there has been growth in employment. Oh, this previous, okay, I remember. There hasn't been the kind of growth that there should have been, but more importantly, real wages haven't increased. See, in the previous decade, I mean, there was growth of employment, but the complaint was these are not formal jobs. They were right. But they were informal jobs and they were giving higher wages. What we've seen more recently, and this, by the way, is contested. I mean, we should have had my good friend Sujit Bhalla here to set you right on this. He doesn't agree with this view, but I think I should mention it. But from what I've seen, it's very clear that the real wage has stagnated. And that's pretty bad if the economy is growing. And that is really what the K-shaped recovery and that kind of thing is. I agree with that. Well, yeah,
The only increase in employment is unpaid women working in family enterprises.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That's not employment.
No, but, you know, look, you can't rule out, you can't disregard. I mean, the point is, if you're a large number of people in farms, and if women are working on farms but not getting paid, I can see the point that maybe we should do something about that. But you can't say they're not being employed.
Employment global definition is when you are paid.
I agree.
Otherwise, every woman doing housework is employed.
Fair point.
Come on.
Fair point. No, fair, I'm only making the point that, you know, it's not clear what to do about that, in the sense that what you're really saying is women should have opportunities for employment outside the home, which would automatically be paid. That's correct, fair point. No, I agree. I mean, but you know, that is why I feel that to say the employment rate of women is low and call that a positive factor is wrong. The fact is there are a lot of women. We know that if they get decent jobs outside, they will take them up. But those jobs are not there. So the question is, what do we do about that? Yeah, fair.
I'm sorry to intrude into this very interesting exchange, but in the interest of time, I think we have just another 6 minutes to go. One last question I would like to raise to the panel, to Mr. Ninan, before I throw it open to the audience. Yeah, Mr. Kaul wants to make an intervention as well. So, Mr. Ninan, the sense that one gets is that it's not enough if you grow at 8.5% or 6.5% or 10%, whatever be the number. What's required is a median incomes, wage levels to increase in the country. That's the way you measure a rich country, whether the common man is earning enough to earn a decent livelihood. Now, for that, we need to obviously create more jobs and grow the economy. We come back to that point. In this context, where should we be focusing on creating more jobs? There is this debate going on that we should not be focusing on manufacturing, but we should focus on services. And within manufacturing, whether you should focus on the low-end manufacturing, assembly lines that China is specialized in, or should it be high-tech manufacturing? So what is your sense on this? Where should India focus its energies to create more jobs? Because you can have a 8.5% growth and still be jobless growth.
I'm not a great believer in the proposition that manufacturing will create the jobs in sufficient numbers that we need. There's a very simple reason. It's a little complicated in the sense that we have succeeded in achieving service exports, much more than manufactured exports. And on merchandise trade, you have a deficit of about 6% of GDP, which is huge. And normally, if a country had 6% trade deficit, its currency would collapse. But what holds up the rupee is the surplus on the services side. So you have an expensive currency because of the services success, but your manufacturing can't compete at that currency rate. Now, a central bank can try and bring down the currency rate, but it immediately gets questioned internationally, saying you're a currency manipulator. So there are limits to how much you can do. So the logic of this is that manufacturing is being handicapped by the success of services. And this is very hard to get around. The only way to do it is either through tariffs or through subsidies to make manufacturing compete. And that's what the government is doing through this PLI schemes, which are different from the capital subsidy schemes. The capital subsidy scheme is completely indefensible, like you're doing for this chip plant in Gujarat. 70% of the capital is being given by the two governments, center and state. And that's absurd for creating 5,000 jobs. Whereas in PLI, you have to achieve the production to get the benefit from the government. And these are employment-intensive sectors by and large. Well, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, in Andhra Pradesh, there are huge factories employing 10, 20,000 people, which we've never seen before. So if that succeeds, that is one way of doing it. But to get it in sufficient numbers is a handicap for us. So, it's a very unconventional response to say that within agriculture, there are different levels of employment per acre for different crops. Wheat and rice are the least, rice is a little more employment intensive. Wheat is the least employment intensive. If you diversify your agriculture, the per acre man-hours needed goes up 2, 3, 4 times. So, within agriculture, there is scope for more productive work with higher income therefore flowing. So, and I think also the direction of technology is important. Internationally, you have now driverless cars. Tomorrow, you may have driverless trucks. How many drivers are there in India? For something like 20, 25 million cars, every 5th or 6th car, according to the Maruti chairman, has a driver. 5 million jobs. Do you want to sacrifice 5 million jobs to get a driverless car? Every truck is driven by a human being. Do you want driverless trucks? So there are choices on technology. Because increasingly, the world has become more and more unequal in the last 40 years. You have to address that, and you have to look at which direction technology is moving to create more jobs, not to take away jobs. So, there is no simple answer that one can give in a forum like this and say this is the way to do it. But there are issues here which are complicated and which need to be addressed.
Yeah. That's nice. That's a very relevant point you made, Mr. Ninan. But I now move to Mr. Kaul. I think he wants to make an observation.
Is this working? Is this working?
Yeah.
So the issue of livelihoods, I think, is very critical. And to say that a manufacturing base of 14%, 15% is going to be adequate for the country is certainly, I don't think there would be consensus on that. You don't require 40% manufacturing base, but certainly you need to move from 15%. Otherwise, you'll have a very convoluted kind of structure where services occupy 75% of GDP and agriculture is going to come down to 10%. So what are you left with? 90% in, 80% in services and 10% in manufacturing. But the issue is, can you at least for the domestic market create a better manufacturing base? And I think you can. We have experimented with manufacturing clusters, except that when I was a part of the industries department, we created industrial estates outside habitations, outside urban settlements. Because every manufacturing cluster requires people to live there, housing, education. So I think you can, second part of livelihoods is your rural livelihoods. People will move out of agriculture. The best case estimates are 4% for agriculture. Now where do they move? The traditional livelihoods, your handlooms and handicrafts, require a completely different way of looking at it. Why is China able to get 80% of its handloom exports globally? That's market share. And India is struggling with 5%. Obviously, because we have not modernized our traditional livelihoods. We have not looked at scale. We have not looked at market linkages. We have not looked at technology. So I think these are areas we need to look at very seriously, because these have been neglected areas amongst policymakers for the last 2 decades or so.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. I think my monitor says time's up, but I'll probably open the floor for a couple of questions. Yeah, this gentleman here, please identify yourself by name and just ask a sharp question. Can we have a floor mic there, please?
I'm a retired surgeon, and all I want to ask is the systematic dismantling of the public sector system in India a good way to go when there's so much of over-reliance on the private sector, trying to fill the gap where the private sector does not really want to employ people, it sees only profits? Thanks.
Sir, I'm Adil Beg, I'm an economy faculty. In the last 7 years, there has been a speculation and criticisms about the reliability of the GDP data. So all we are talking about rich in 2047 is dependent on the GDP or per capita income. But there has been a huge speculation about the credibility of the data. So if so, what is the problem with the GDP data and how it can be corrected?
Who would like to take these 2 questions? Mr. Ahluwalia or Mr. Ninan or Mr. Ravi? The first question was on public sector disinvestment, whether it is the right way to go. Are we selling off family silver? That's the question, right? And the second one is on the credibility of data that's generated in the country, especially on GDP.
Wasn't sure whether the first question was on privatization as such, or moving away from government hospitals to private hospitals. I thought the focus was within the healthcare. And there, quite honestly, I do think that the movement is, health is not one of those areas where people think the market actually does a good job, because there's a huge amount of asymmetry of information. So if the private sector wants to tempt you away from the public sector, it's rather easy to do that. But let me say, even today, people are not tempted away from AIIMS in Delhi or any of the other AIIMS. So I think if the public sector were to provide good health services, I don't think people would necessarily go away. And I think the real problem there is we're not providing enough money for it, and for some reason, at least when you go to the district level, the public sector hospitals are not seen to be providing a good enough service to those who can afford to move to the private sector. On the GDP numbers, I think they've set up some group or the other to look into it. And it is true that all the experts are saying that our GDP numbers lack quality. I think one of the biggest problems in it, by the way, which is connected with what was said earlier, is that the informal sector, so-called, is not measured directly. It's kind of assumed that if the formal sector is growing at a certain rate, then the informal must also have grown at the same rate. But you know, if distributional changes are taking place, and if you have a K-shaped recovery, where the formal sector is zooming along and the informal sector is not, then if the GDP is using only the formal sector growth and attributing the same growth to the informal sector, it will overstate the growth rate. And I think they've set up a group, which is a very good idea. I saw that in the newspapers. I have no inside information. We should get, this issue should be resolved. There's a slightly more technical issue also, and that is whether we do double deflation or not. Because, you know, GDP measures value added. And what actually happens is that at the moment, value added is just the gross output minus all the inputs. Not labor, but all the physical inputs. And that is value added, and that's usually deflated by the output inflation index. Whereas what people say is that you should deflate the gross value by the output index and the inputs by the input inflating by the input index, then look at constant price value added. I mean, that's what everybody else does, and we should do it, and I don't know why we don't do it. But if a direction were given that that's what we should do, it will get done. I mean.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. We're terribly out of time. Ms. Jayanti Natarajan wanted to ask a question.
Yes, my question also was specifically for Mr. Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, why does your mind automatically go to cutting electricity for agriculturists? Of course, the large, very big agriculturists who do not need that subsidy don't need it. The small, perhaps the small ones do. I'm not getting into that at all. When you talk about climate change, what about corporates? Polluters should pay. Right now in Chennai, we had an oil spill by, nobody pays. Government doesn't talk about it. No corporates actually, when you talk about climate change, adaptation, when you talk about mitigation, what about all those, you know, what are the laws looking like? They don't look good at all. Do the corporates actually go out and pay those people who've suffered? In North Madras, we had an enormous oil spill. Thousands of fishermen, millions of fish were found dead. So many fishermen lost their livelihood. Do you think that that was a public sector company? Do you think they're going to pay? It's only the National Green Tribunal, virtually without teeth, which has no power to actually enforce it. I want to know what percentage we're going to save by cutting the free electricity for agriculture, because I'm worried what will happen if agriculture will go out. Because right now, there are big buildings being built on agricultural lands, and soon we won't be producing food. And I want to know why people's mind automatically goes there and not about how polluters should pay. We are living just outside a nuclear facility in Chennai. There are so many things that worry us. We don't talk about those things at all.
Ms. Natarajan.
I'd like your views on that, and I'd like to give a shout out to Jayati. 1000% yes. I think that women are not considered in any pattern at all, and I'd like to express my gratitude to you for bringing it up.
Yeah, Mr. Ahluwalia, very quickly, if you want to respond to her question.
But I think we should endorse the gratitude to Jayati. There is a wide public support, and she's right. No, let's be clear about it. It's totally clear that the environmental pollution laws should be enforced without any kind of laxity. And I mean, that's really the job of, again, it's a classic case, it's a state government's job. And this is one of the areas where you need to strengthen the application of the law. Whether the polluting agent is a public sector agent or a private sector agent, I mean, that's one of the most important things we should do. You know, on the issue of agriculture, it's very simple to handle that problem. That is, don't give the subsidy via free agriculture, but give a targeted subsidy to the poor farmers. I mean, that would make a huge difference. I mean, look, in Punjab, for example, the free subsidy is leading to a steady depletion of the water table and converting, I mean, the policy will end up converting the state into a desert unless somebody does something about it. Now, to be fair, we've known this for 25 years. Actually, I mean, even earlier. But it has just continued without change.
Thank you. I'm afraid we really have to stop here. I see several hands going up. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time. We are cutting into the time for the next session. So I would like to wind up here. Given the nature of the subject, obviously there's much more interest amongst the audience, and the panelists, the distinguished panelists, each one of them can hold this audience for a whole day. So, but we can't spare that kind of time, unfortunately. So I would like to wind up here. Thank you all. Thanks for your patience, and I do hope you take back something home with you.